Hello, everyone. My name's Anthony, and I'm one of the SIs for Dr. Joseph's Bio 5B class. And today I'm going to do a quick mini lecture, kind of going over the topics from Monday, week three's lecture. That is the one covering the echinoderms and the chordates. And so we're just going to kind of go over those topics. So the first thing I want to do before I get into those topics, I actually want to kind of help you guys study for your upcoming midterm, because one of the questions I've been getting a lot is how to study for this class. And so I'm just going to suggest like one way that you guys could be able to start, studying for this midterm that's coming up. And that is to build your own tree of life. It's one of the ways that almost every other Bio 5B student starts learning about this is they build their own tree, right? Because a lot of this is memorization based and trying to memorize what are the characteristics for this clade and what are the characteristics for this clade. And so to help you guys be able to memorize all of those terms and to be able to put those terms together and compare and contrast them, it's really beneficial for you guys to be able to make your own tree. And so this is actually a tree that I made when I was taking the class many, many years ago. And that is, looking at this tree, I started at metazoa, which are those animals, right? Those tissues. And then you get to eumetazoa, yada, yada, yada. But the key thing is that you start adding on those characteristics and those traits that you need to memorize that are specific to that trait, that clade. And so, for example, we're going to be talking about chordata today, right? And so you need to know what are those unique traits that are specific to chordata. And so if you look at my tree, right, and if you look right here at chordata, I put those 4 defining traits that are unique to chordata that make it different than echinodermata. And so those are the kind of the comparisons that you need to start building. Obviously, if you make this tree bigger and you can start adding more space for different traits and things like that. So this is just kind of one study technique that will really help you visualize, memorize, put it all together, see the big picture. And I think it was super useful. So that's one way you can start studying. If you have more questions about how to study for this class, or if you need some more help, feel free to come to any of the office hours. There's office hours for SI every day of the week, Monday through Friday. So if you need some help, go ahead and come ask one of us. Okay, so on to the actual material. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Echinodermata. And this is the first group within the deuterostome. So now we're just going to be talking about deuterostome. So you should be familiar with the characteristics of a deuterostome. And so we're going to be talking about the first clade within deuterostomata. And so let's talk just about those traits that are unique to echinoderms. And so that's kind of how I'm going to go over today's lecture. So we're going to talk about what are the unique traits to this clade, right? And that way you'll be able to understand what makes this different from other clades. But then it's also part of your job to learn what are those similarities, right? So what are those unifying traits that we've already established by saying this is in deuterostomata? So because it's in deuterostomata, you should know where the anus is coming from. Is it from the blastopore? Or you should know, is it radial or spiral based on it being in the deuterostomata clade, right? So you need to understand what are those general things that it has, but also what makes it unique. So today we're just going to talk about what are those unique characteristics. So first of all, this clade, all of echinoderms are aquatic. So that means they're in the ocean, they're marine, and that is really unique because that kind of defines the way that their body is set up. So the first thing is they have a simple nerve net. So they actually do have nerves, they have sensory organs, they can feel things, but instead of them being cephalized, which means that all of their sensory organs are located in one area. So kind of like in humans, we're cephalized because all of our sensory organs are in our head. It's on one side of the body. Instead, these starfish or these echinoderms have their nerves spread throughout their entire body. And they have just a big net of all these nerves. The next thing is they have an endoskeleton, and the endoskeleton is inside and it's covered by a thin epidermis. And the reason that it's thin is that way they can have the spines and things coming from that endoskeleton stick out, and they can have that kind of interaction with the environment. Another unique defining trait that separates the echinoderms from previous things we've talked about is that now we have sexual reproduction. So we do have separate sexes, and we have external gametes that come together through fertilization and they form a zygote. And that's kind of what you should be familiar with when we were talking about the sexual reproduction process earlier. Something else that's really unique to this is because they all are aquatic, they have to have a water vascular system. And this is the means in which they move, they feed, and they do gas exchange. And Dr. Joseph went in depth talking about those mechanisms. So be sure to go back to that lecture and review if you still need some more help. So these are kind of the unique defining traits that make the echinoderms different than other things. And so now we're going to talk about the chordatas. So this is a unique clade that has very specific features. So these are very defining, and if you have all four of these, you will be put in the chordata clade. So Dr. Joseph went in detail about all of these. I'm going to give you guys a brief overview of just the unique ones that you need to know. And so the first one is a notochord, right? So the notochord is structural support. And the key thing here is that it comes from the mesoderm. That is, remember, if you go back to your three tissue types, you should remember that you have endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. And so the notochord is being created from that mesoderm tissue, and it's support for the hollow nerve cord. And the nerve cord is coming from, that's the second trait, it's coming from ectoderm tissue, not mesoderm tissue. So that hollow nerve cord is being formed from ectoderm tissue, and it sits right above that notochord, and it's a precursor to that spinal cord that's eventually going to be created later on as we evolve. The third one is pharyngeal slits. So those pharyngeal slits are precursors. So their original purpose was actually for filter feeding. So they would suck in all this water and they feed on anything they could catch. But eventually, again, they'll evolve. Their original purpose was for filter feeding, but they'll eventually evolve for respiration later on. And number four is that there is a postanal tail. Usually this is seen in embryonic stages. So we too have embryonic tails, but again, that's in the embryonic stage. And it's just a tail that comes off around the anus. So those are all of the unique traits that are specific to chordates. And now we're going to start diving into clades that are within this clade. So again, you have clades nested in clades, and so you have to be really careful about what is making this clade unique compared to what we previously talked about. So kind of keep those things in mind, keep them straight. Again, if you need help, try organizing them on that tree like I showed you in the beginning. So the next thing we're going to talk about is vertebrates. And vertebrates are a clade that's within the chordata clade. So now we're going to start diving in and we're going to start talking about clades within clades. So that's where I was trying to get you guys to really understand that you have to start understanding what are the unique features of this clade that make it separate from what we've been previously talking about. And so for the vertebrates, the most obvious and clear one that you should right off the bat come to mind is that it has a vertebral column, right? So that's a backbone. And so these are these segmented portions that are now that structural support for the spinal cord. And it replaces the notochord, which was that previous form of structural support. And among other things, right, so we have that vertebral column, but now we have to start talking that many people forget when it comes to vertebrates, there are many other things that make it a defining feature. And so the second one that people often forget is that now it does have that skeletal system with a skull. So now we have that skull head portion and really defines that cephalization. We have all those sensory organs in one place in that skull. Along with that is now that we can have more complex nervous systems, right? So you have this development of the head, you have the development of the brain that comes along with it. So that's a complex nervous system instead of just that hollow dorsal nerve cord. And the last one that's really important and that I think people often forget about is number four, the neural crest cells. So when you have that skull, when you have that head, there's very unique features. Like, for example, you have teeth, right, in the head. You also need the cells to create all of those features of the head. So these neural crest cells are going to come off, they actually migrate, and they form portions of the head, things like the teeth, that'll be part of that vertebral cranium. And so these are all the unique features that define a vertebrate. Not only does it have that vertebral column, but it has all these other features as well. So you really need to be sure you have those down and memorized. Okay, so now we're getting deeper in, right? Another clade within a clade. And we have to figure out what are the defining features of the gnathosomes. And so the gnathosomes, it's very easy for this one. There's one major defining trait in that now we have jaws. So before we had the cranium, we just had a skull. But now we have a specific jaw that's used for feeding. And this is, again, it evolved as those skeletal structural supports for pharyngeal slits. So the pharyngeal slits were originally there, supported by these skeletal systems, and then they eventually evolved to become this jaw. And this is a form of selection where this jaw was probably favored because of its more nutritious feeding mechanisms. And so this is a very unique trait. It's the only one that defines those gnathosomes. And so make sure you have that kind of down as well. So To kind of help you guys practice your material, since this week on the worksheet there wasn't much multiple choice questions, we're going to give you some multiple questions here. So let's get into it. Practice multiple choice questions. So the first one, what is one characteristic that separates chordates from all other animals? So this is an example of a question that I was talking about that would test your knowledge of how well you know those unique defining characteristics and be able to separate them from those previous animals that we've been already talking about, those protostomes, invertebrates, all of that. What are some defining traits specific to the chordates? And so if you had the ones that I talked about previously memorized, or give you this time to read it, pause if you want to answer this question. I'll give you a minute right now. So hopefully you guys were able to figure out that the correct answer was B, the postanal tail. So that was the fourth one that we talked about, that fourth trait that is specifically to chordates. It's a defining characteristic, and that kind of comes from being able to look at that tree and know that the reason it branches off, one of the traits that makes it diverge, so that derived trait, is a postanal tail. Okay, question number 2. What chordate is postulated to be the most like the earliest chordates in appearance? So I'll give you a minute. Go ahead, pause me right now. Answer this question in your free time. And so you guys should have come to the conclusion that the correct answer was a lancelet. And again, this comes from knowing that tree, right? This is kind of a little bit of a memorization portion. These next few lectures as well are also going to be a little bit of more of the memory ability to test that kind of information. So if you knew your chordates and you were looking at your chordate tree, you can probably have it in front of you right now if you wanted to. You would see that the earliest chordate, if you had it memorized, would be that lancelet. It's the outgroup. It's the first one that's derived. And you could have also known it by its formal name, Chordata. But either one is good. So you need to know both the formal name and the common name, but lancelet was good here. Number 3. Chordate pharyngeal slits appear to have functioned first as, go ahead and take a minute, pause me. You should have gotten that number 3. The correct answer is B, suspension feeding. So its original purpose, the key word here is function first as a suspension feeding device. So that was its original goal, was this is how people were eating before they had jaws. And if you had known that later on, it would have derived a jaw, and that would have been a later on trait. You would have known that it wasn't for jaws, you would have known it wasn't for respiration, because all of those come after the creation of those pharyngeal slits. Okay, question number 4. All of these might have been observed in the common ancestors of chondrostithians and ostithians, except, go ahead, take a minute. And the correct answer is E, a swim bladder. And for this question, you would have had to know the difference between these two. And so ostithians are the only ones that have that swim bladder. And so therefore, a common ancestor of both these two wouldn't have a swim bladder. It is a derived trait that is specific only to the ostithians and wouldn't be found in a common ancestor of both, right? So my main takeaway from this video is that I want you guys to be able to know those unique characteristics, the ones that make this clade different than other clades, being able to distinguish those defining features, and then also be able to look at a broad scale, big picture idea, what are those traits that connect all of these clades together? What are those big picture ancestral traits that are shared between these different clades? And so with that, thank you for listening to this video. If you have any questions, feel free to comment in this YouTube video below, or you can drop by any of the office hours. We're here Monday through Friday, every day of the week. We have office hours and we welcome you guys to come to them. If you have any more questions, feel free to let me know. Thank you for listening.